The diner's air was heavy with the scent of burnt coffee and fried batter. Yet it wasn't the smell that made her hands tremble, it was the eyes. Dozens of them, strangers pretending not to stare, watching as the glass shattered on the floor, and soda hissed across her shoes. The rich boy's smirk clung to the air like oil on water. Somewhere outside, the rain tapped the roof in soft apology, but inside, time stretched thin and cruel. She bent to clean the mess, her heart beat loud in her ears, never knowing the man who would change everything had just walked through the door. She had worked at that roadside diner for 2 years, her life a rhythm of coffee refills, late-night shifts, and paychecks that barely held the months together. Her shoes were worn at the soles, her uniform faded to the color of old photographs. Yet she moved through the place with a grace she didn't notice, like rain sliding down a window, steady and unbothered. The regulars liked her because she remembered the little things, the extra napkin without being asked, the coffee topped up before the cup was empty. But the day the silver car pulled into the cracked asphalt lot, her small, unnoticed world shifted. He came in wearing wealth-like armor designer shoes untouched by mud, a watch that gleamed under the dim diner lights, and a smirk that said, the world had always bent toward him. She placed a menu in front of him, but he barely looked up. The other waitresses avoided the table. Something in his posture promised trouble by the time the lunch rush came. The diner's hum had grown louder, plates clattering, laughter spilling from booths. That was when it happened, a drink cold fizzing and sharp with sugar from his hand. Or maybe it hadn't slipped at all. It drenched her uniform in dark syrup, dripping down her arms. A chorus of stifled laughs rose from the nearby table. Her skin burned, but not from the soda. It was the heat of humiliation, the heavy weight of every gaze fixed on her. She said nothing, only knelt to gather the pieces, each shard cutting her fingertips. What she didn't see, what no one noticed, was the man standing just inside the doorway, watching her with eyes that didn't match the stranger's cruelty. Eyes that softened as they took in the sight of her, crouched on the tile floor, a quiet dignity holding her together while the world tried to break her. The man in the doorway didn't move at first. He stood in the shadow of the neon sign that buzzed faintly above the open door, his hands loose at his sides, gaze fixed on her. The storm outside was beginning to thicken, streaks of rain painting the glass. He watched her mop the spill without complaint, her back curved, her hair falling forward to shield her face. She worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd cleaned messes far worse than this, in places where no one said thank you. There was a steadiness to her, a refusal to let the moment shatter her spirit, even though the room's air carried the metallic sting of embarrassment. And the corner booth, a group of well-dressed men in tailored jackets leaned toward each other, their laughter muffled but sharp. The rich boy among them leaned back with his arms stretched along the seat, tapping his shoe against the floor, radiating satisfaction. To them, it was nothing, just another story to tell later, another nameless waitress who'd fade from memory. Before dessert, the man in the doorway slid into a seat by the window, a vantage point where he could see both her and the boy. He ordered nothing. He simply sat there, the stormlight casting silver along the creases of his face, studying her movements like someone reading a book. He didn't want to finish too soon. She rose from the floor, her knees stiff, and wheeled the mop bucket away. Her hands were red from the soda's stickiness and the sting of glass cuts. Without looking at anyone, she fetched another order from the counter and carried it across the diner. Her uniform clung damply to her skin, but her spine stayed straight. The man noticed something the others didn't, how she made room for a child running between tables without breaking stride, how she steadied an old man's coffee cup before it tipped, all while the humiliation still clung to her like smoke. Somewhere in his chest, a decision was forming. The storm outside swelled into a full downpour, rain streaking the diner's windows, until the world beyond blurred into a watercolor of gray and silver. Inside, the air felt heavier, thick with the smell of fried food, the clink of silverware, and something else in spoken tension that seemed to knot itself around the tables. The man by the window hadn't touched a menu. His hands rested on the table, weathered but steady, the way a man's hands looked after decades of work. Even if his suit was cut from fabric worth more than a month's wages here. He wasn't watching the rich boy anymore. His eyes followed only her. She moved like someone who had learned to be invisible, never lingering, never meeting a gaze for too long, never asking for help. It was a kind of armor, forged not in pride, but in survival. The humiliation still clung to her uniform, the syrupy stains darkening the fabric, but she worked on unbroken. The boy in the corner laughed again, loud enough for her to hear, though she didn't look his way. His friends had leaned into the cruelty now, the kind that comes easy when you know the world forgives you. Each time she passed their booth, their laughter swelled. The man at the window saw the way her jaw tightened for half a second. When she thought no one was looking, saw the way she slowed her steps near the register as if to catch her breath before going back into the storm of their mockery. He thought of the hundreds of people he had met in rooms with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors, men with perfect smiles and women who could command a room with a single glance. Yet here, in this small diner with its cracked vinyl booths and flickering lights, stood the truest example of grace he'd seen in years. And then his gaze shifted. To the boy, his own son, the recognition was sharp, but the disappointment was sharper. He'd raised him with every advantage, every open door, yet here he was, wasting it, wearing privilege like a weapon. The father's chest tightened. He didn't move yet, not until he was certain how he wanted this to end. The rain hammered harder against the glass. Somewhere deep inside, a moment was forming that would leave the entire room silent. The diner's hum carried on orders called from the kitchen, plates sliding onto counters, the metallic ring of the cash register, but beneath it all, there was a quieter current, a shift, as if the air knew what was coming before the people did. The man at the window rose slowly, the motion deliberate, unhurried, his chair scraped softly against the floor, a sound almost lost beneath the storm outside. He adjusted his jacket, ran a hand along the table's edge, and began to walk. Each step was steady, measured, not a man rushing into confrontation, but one carrying the weight of something far older, years of knowing when silence cut deeper than words, and when action had to speak for you. She was at the far end of the room, balancing 2 plates on one arm and a coffee pot in the other, weaving between tables as though she were part of the diner's architecture. Her hair clung damply to her temple from the earlier spill, her uniform still marked with dark stains, but her movements hadn't faltered. The boy in the corner noticed first. His smile faltered, his posture straightened. He watched his father's approach, a faint crease forming between his brows. The laughter at the table thinned, unsure of what was happening. The man didn't look at him. Not yet. His gaze was fixed on the way she set a plate in front of a tired trucker with a small, automatic nod of thanks. On the way she steadied the coffee pot before pouring, even though her hands must have been aching. When he reached her, he stopped just far enough away not to interrupt her rhythm. The room seemed to notice them both at once now, conversations softening into murmurs. Even the rain seemed to hush for a moment. She glanced up briefly, perhaps out of habit, perhaps sensing something unusual. Whatever she saw in his face made her pause mid-step, just for a breath. But she turned away again, back to the counter, back to the work that didn't wait for kindness. Behind them, the boy's eyes shifted between his father and the waitress, confusion replacing his earlier smugness. Something unspoken had entered the room, something that would not leave with the storm. The man took another step toward her, this time closing the space between them until the hum of the diner seemed to fade entirely. His presence carried weight, not the kind that bent a room with authority, but the kind that rooted it in stillness. She had just set the coffee pot back on the counter when he stopped beside her. For a heartbeat, she didn't look at him, her body still caught in the rhythm of work, her mind on the orders waiting to be filled. But then his shadow fell across her hands, and she froze. Without a word, he reached out, not to shake her hand, not to tip her, but to draw her into an embrace. It was not quick or awkward. It was the kind of embrace that acknowledged something unspoken. The kind that said, "I see you," without moving a single syllable through the air. Her breath caught in the space between them. For a moment, she stood stiffly, unsure if the gesture was meant for her, unsure if she was even allowed such a kindness. But his arm stayed firm around her, steady as the ground beneath her feet. The diner went silent, forks paused midway to mouths, conversations cut off mid. Even the boy in the corner seemed carved into stillness, his eyes wide as though he'd never seen his father touch another human being that way. And then, slowly, something in her yielded. Her shoulders softened, her hands lifted slightly, not to return the embrace fully, but to let herself exist inside it. The kind of surrender that comes from realizing someone is holding more than just your body, they're holding the weight you've been carrying alone. When he finally stepped back, his hands remained on her shoulders for a brief moment, his gaze steady on hers. No words were spoken, but the look between them told a story no one else in the room could fully read. The boy's chair scraped the floor as he stood, but the father didn't turn to him. Not yet. His attention remained fixed on the woman who, moments ago, had been invisible to most of the room. The storm outside had softened to a drizzle, but inside, something irreversible had shifted. The man turned at last, his gaze settling on the boy who had been watching with a stiffness that betrayed something between shame and disbelief. No words passed between them, but the look was a new mirror held up, an unflinching reflection of who the boy had been in that moment. and who his father expected him to be. The boy's shoulders seemed to shrink beneath his tailored jacket. His eyes fell, the sharp edges of his earlier arrogance blunting under the weight of that silent reckoning. The friends beside him shifted uncomfortably, glancing anywhere but at the man standing in the center of the room. The father didn't linger on them. He returned his gaze to the woman, offering a single, small nod that carried the gravity of a promise that her dignity had not gone unseen, that in a world too quick to bruise and discard, someone had chosen to remember her. She stood there, still holding the damp rag in her hand, her pulse slowly steadying. The storm outside had eased into a soft, rhythmic drizzle, the kind that makes the air smell clean again. She felt it then, not relief exactly, but the faint warmth of being acknowledged, of being seen beyond the uniform and the mess on the floor. He left without ceremony, the bell above the door giving a single chime as the rain light spilled briefly across the diner's floor. The boy followed, his stride quicker, the silence between them heavy and unbroken. The waitress turned back to her work, not because she had to, but because work was what she knew. And yet, something inside her had shifted like a door cracked open to a room she'd never been in. A place where she wasn't just the one cleaning up after the mess, but someone worth stepping forward for. Outside, the car door closed, the engine started, and the silver sedan rolled back onto the wet road, vanishing into the horizon where the storm was breaking. Inside, the diner slowly found its noise again, but the echo of that embrace lingered woven into the air like a thread. No one could quite see, but everyone felt.